You know, one of my guilty pleasures is like the old black and white 50s television shows. The good old Leave It to Beaver kind of shows. And I love them because they're decidedly uncomplicated. When problems arise, they're usually wrapped up in 30 minutes where mom and dad know just the right thing to say, where the kids end up getting along, and it is a pretty picture of what we really wish life was like. And you can turn that on, and in any time you can turn it on. You can say, "Man, you know that's what I want. I want my days to look like that." But unfortunately, that's not how most of our days go. This morning I want to talk about the temple. And I want to talk about it with that idea of this ideal thing that we'll never fully embody in mind. Because I think in some really actually deep ways, the 50s American sitcom serves as a temple for American life. And we're going to talk about how the temple functions a little bit this morning. I want to begin with our reading in 1 Kings chapter 5, starting in verse 1. It says, "Now Hiram, king of Tyre, sent his servants to Solomon when he had heard that they had anointed him king in place of his father. For Hiram always loved David. And Solomon sent word to Hiram, 'You know that David, my father, could not build a house for the name of the Lord his God because of the warfare with which his enemies surrounded him, until the Lord put them under the soles of his feet. But now the Lord my God has given me rest on every side. There is neither adversary nor misfortune, and so I intend to build a house for the name of the Lord my God. And as the Lord said to David my father, your son, whom I will set on your throne in your place, shall build the house for my name.'" And so Solomon becomes king, and he believes that it is time to build a place for God's name. He believes that it's time to build a house for God. And what I want to talk about to set the stage a little bit is what exactly that means. You see, up until this point in Israel's history, they didn't have, they had the tabernacle, but it was perfectly acceptable to offer sacrifice in other places. You read stories about people building shrines in other places to worship God. You have Abraham, who builds an altar to God to offer sacrifice. You have Samuel, who builds an altar before a battle to offer sacrifice. Up until this point, it's thought fairly okay to build a shrine, to build a altar, to offer sacrifice to God. And this is common in a lot of ancient religions. A move from a non-centralized place of worship to kind of a centralized place. And the reason they did this was they had this sense of dis-ease about what they were, how what they did showed who God was. You see, they say things like, it's not good for God to dwell in a tent. They'll say, it's not good for us to offer sacrifice out in the open, kind of haphazardly. They said, this doesn't really show who God is. And so a lot of religions actually started to build temples. The temple behind me is a Canaanite temple from around the same era. And so the temples were huge investments. When we think about the kind of edifices that spring up nowadays, they can spring up overnight, it seems. Construction has come so far, so quickly. We have skyscrapers that go up in a year. I mean, these are massive things that come up very quickly with a few 100,000 man-hours. These things were lifetime investments. Lifetime investments. To get a little stone column would take stonemasons years of their lives, multiple stonemasons, to get each little section of the column in place. These were not things that just happened. And because of that, they weren't haphazard either. Each part meant something. Each part was intentional. They wanted to say something about the God they worshiped with each piece. And so what I want to do is I want to think about a little bit God's temple. If you look at the tabernacle, which the temple is kind of based on that same design, the temple is kind of modeled to show holiness and kind of this concept of order, along with this concept of sacrifice. The way that the tabernacle was set up actually reflects creation, and we'll talk about that here in a moment. That God kind of creates and then separates and orders things. There were sections of the tabernacle that people couldn't go in, except for once a year, and only then the high priest. You have the separation. Then outside of that, you have a section where only certain people can go. And the way that the temple had it, it had a court for the Gentiles and the ungendered. It had a court for the male Jews, the female Jews. It had places for them all to be, because this kind of orderliness reflected something about God, His holiness. And then there was a large portion of it that was dedicated to sacrifice. You had the altar, which was a grand construction. You had the places for ritual washing before sacrifice. And sacrifice to us is kind of, it's archaic. It doesn't make a whole lot of sense to think about things in terms of sacrifice nowadays. But it's really, sacrifice is not just present in the Jewish religion. It's found in other places. And the idea of sacrifice is kind of embodying this idea that I've got to give up something now so that I can get something that I want in the future. And we do this in our daily lives. We give up things that we want to do now. We go to work so that we will have a paycheck and be able to live. We embody sacrifice in our daily life. And so these people kind of acted that out in a way that showed that they believed it, and that it's really kind of it's hard to talk about nowadays because we just don't think in those terms. But the temple served kind of these two purposes. It showed things about God in His holiness, and it also showed things about God in the sacrifices that were given, how He expects us to give of ourselves for the good of Him and for the good of each other. The way that I want to talk about this for a moment is to think about Genesis, because the way that Genesis is formed, the way that Genesis kind of, Genesis 1 especially, takes this idea of creation is kind of in the frame of a temple, of a temple of God. And it's very interesting to me, because if you think about when Genesis is actually compiled, it's shortly after the temple is destroyed, and so they're thinking in terms of temple. And the way that the writer of Genesis talks about it, we talked about it just a moment ago. He speaks, "Let there be light," and there was light. And then God separates the light from the darkness. And then He speaks and He says, "Let there be an expanse in the waters." And there's just this speaking into creation and into separation. This taking this chaotic mess that it describes at the beginning, this darkness and void, and speaking light and order into it. And then once He does that, he crowns His creation with man and woman. And the way that He sets it up, he puts them in a garden, and He says, "You're going to tend this garden, and you're going to work here." And so God sets up creation itself really as a temple for Him to dwell. That we would look at creation and know Him. We would know His orderliness, and we would know His holiness. And He put the first human really as a priest to tend the temple. And yet, unfortunately, this holiness and order is broken by the fall. And the perfect image of God that was reflected in creation is twisted and corrupted. And this, what used to be an accurate representation of God in creation is now marred. And so the temple for the Jews serves as a ideal of what the perfect creation could be, of what the world should have been. Just like our American sitcom. Maybe your life is messed up. Maybe you've got a terrible tragedy that has struck. But you can turn on the television and see something that's better. See something that could be. See that ideal that's still out there. The temple functions for the Jews in much the same way. It is the place where we can see the world as it was meant to be. And that kind of brings me to what I want to talk about as it relates to us. The Christian life is a structure with a similar purpose. The way that we read this a moment ago in 1 Peter is he says, you are being built up into a spiritual house. And the thing is, the way that the Jewish people understood this spiritual house, I mean, you just look on in 1 Kings 8, when Solomon, the builder of the temple himself, says this, will God indeed dwell on the earth? Behold, the highest heaven cannot contain him. How much less a house that I have built? They've never thought that they could actually build a place where God was fully housed and embodied. But they said, we can use this place to get a glimpse of who God is and what He expects the world to be like. We ourselves are to be a place like that. 1 Peter 2, I'll read it again just so that we can have some context here. It says, starting in verse 4, as you come to Him, a living stone rejected by men, but in the sight of God chosen and precious, you yourselves, like living stones, are being built up as a spiritual house, to be a holy priesthood, to offer spiritual sacrifices acceptable to God through Jesus Christ. For it stands in Scripture, behold, I am laying in Zion a stone, a cornerstone chosen and precious. Whoever believes in Him will not be put to shame. So the honor is for you who believe, but for those who do not believe, the stone that the builders rejected has become the head of the corner, and the stone of stumbling, a rock of offense. They stumbled because they disobeyed the word as they were destined to do, but you are a chosen race, a holy priesthood, a holy nation, a people for His own possession, that you may proclaim the excellencies of Him who called you out of darkness into His marvelous light. Once you were not a people, but now you are God's people. Once you had not received mercy, but now you have received mercy. You see, Peter puts this together saying that you were enemies of God, but He's called you into His priesthood. And in these temples, that the structures themselves were to represent God to the people. The priests had an even more important job. They were to personify the deity. If you look at Greek worship, they would actually take the robes off the statues and wear them during the holidays to say, this is what the God would look like. The priests in temples were supposed to represent who God is in a way that people could know and have a relationship with. When you would offer sacrifices in the temple, you wouldn't just burn up the meat on the altar, although there is one sacrifice that does that. You would sit down and have a meal with the priest, that God would join you at the table. We do that here every Sunday, where God joins us at the table. And so our very lives, Peter says, are supposed to be this temple. Our very lives are supposed to serve this function, where we can offer sacrifice every day. Our lives is sacrifice, where we can show holiness to others. The temple doesn't happen by accident. These ancient structures, I told you, they take lifetimes to build. And every minute detail is intentional. If we want to have lives that accurately reflect God, we need to be intentional about it. This is not going to happen by accident. You're not going to stumble into representing God. It's not going to just happen. We need to work to structure our lives to do this. That's going to take studying of God's Word. That's going to take practicing Christian life. It's going to take a lot of work. But it's worth it. I love the way that Jesus puts it. He says, "A city on a hill cannot be hidden. Neither do you light a lamp or put it under a bowl. So therefore let your light shine before men, that they may see your good works and glorify your Father who is in heaven." It's not any city on a hill that he's talking about. That's Jerusalem. He says, Jerusalem is the place where God is. People can look at that and say, yes, I know who God is. I know what my purpose is. I know where I fit into this world. He says, you're supposed to be like that. You. And so let it shine. Let it shine. What's really interesting about the angle that Peter takes on this, to me, is when he talks about this temple, this holy house being built up, he compares us to bricks, the bricks of the temple. We ourselves aren't going to be able to fully embody God to the world. We're not going to be able to fully show who God is, what He's doing, and how everyone fits into His glorious vision for what the world should be. We're not going to be able to do that by ourselves. The way that Peter says it, he says, you need to be in community with others who are doing the same. One brick by itself does not make a house. It is when the bricks are laid together that they build up something that testifies to who God is. We believe who God, we've caught this vision of who God is, and we're trying to embody it. And he even says that this is going to be a challenge. He says there are people who are not going to accept this. There are people who are going to see what you're doing and say, no, thank you. He says the stone that has been rejected has become the cornerstone. He says there are people who are building a temple that doesn't look like yours. They're building a temple who are praising a God that has nothing to do with you. And they have rejected the stone that all things should be built on, that is Jesus Christ. He says, but you need to hold fast to that and build upon that, because that person, that the gospel itself is how we build up our house. And so this morning, I want to ask you, what are you building your house on? What structure, what purpose is the structure of your life serving? Maybe you need to believe the gospel this morning for the first time. You need to confess your faith in Jesus and put Him on in baptism. Engage in your journey, engage in your obligation as priest this morning. This is the time for that. Maybe you've forgotten that you were created to love God's creation, to tend it, to love others, to represent God to Him. Maybe you made that commitment, but that task has not been on your to-do list. If you need to recommit to that this morning, this is time for that as well. If you have any need, would you please come as we stand and sing.